So yeah, Ben de Waal. I've been involved in Bitcoin since around 2010, but been involved in other similar things, for quite a lot longer. So I'm an anarchist, politically speaking, and very interested in cryptography, the cypherpunk ethos, making the world a better place without centralized systems.
Right on, and you're a fellow Australasian down from Kiwi.
I am, yep. Invercargill born and raised, so deep south of the world, and travelled the world a lot since then. So been to every continent, lived in 5 countries, speak a few languages. Yeah.
Right on. And so I'm kind of familiar with Proof of Work and the Proof of Work Summit, but I was told that there would be quite a few sort of cypherpunk anarchist type individuals who are like really into decentralization, which is a really fascinating subject of my previous documentaries and future documentaries too. But something I did come across more recently was this idea of the network state movement. So could you briefly sort of run me through what that is exactly?
Actually, that's something I probably can't talk as well on as a lot of other people, but generally speaking, there are different ways you can imagine society being. So you can imagine society as what we currently have with centralized governments, very defined borders between countries, and the ways that people actually interact with each other. There are other approaches. So there are ideas like having virtual states of a kind, where essentially you've got a centralized system, but the people themselves are more distributed. Personally, I don't advocate for any of those kinds of things. I go for more of a bottom-up approach. So the general political concept is called libertarian socialism, but I generally prefer the simple term anarchist, whereby you have a bottom-up approach of people getting together, solving problems individually, solving problems in their communities, and then scaling that up so that large-scale politics simply becomes an emergent property of the smaller-scale politics rather than the other way around.
Right. Okay. And so, how just practically speaking, how do you kickstart something like that in a fashion of which you would obviously like it to sustain and maintain itself as it scales up, I see.
So that's one of the difficult things which anarchism has always faced. The problem with trying to organize anything is that if you don't have an end goal in mind, it's very, very difficult to get a bunch of people together. And anarchism precludes the idea of having an end goal in mind. Often you get these, they call themselves libertarians, but I actually prefer the term LARPitarians because they're really just LARPing the entire thing.
And LARPing is
live action role playing, so essentially pretending, faking. And they imagine themselves as some kind of independent mountain man living there with their automatic weapon, looking after their own stuff, and they're completely free. I don't consider that freedom, I consider that self-isolation. Freedom is the ability to do what you want, when you want, as a part of society. So liberty actually is an aspect of a society. You need to have people around you, and you need to have the maximal freedom within that society. So I generally think that libertarian approach is kind of stupid or silly or childish. So instead, when it comes to organizing anarchistically, it's more about finding small wins and aiming towards those. So looking at society as it exists and saying, what is currently centralized that doesn't need to be? What is currently having unnecessary hierarchies that don't need to be there? And then finding other ways around it. So it's why I'm a Bitcoiner, it's why I find Bitcoin so fascinating, because right now, money is controlled by centralized entities. It's controlled by states and central banks, and to a lesser extent, commercial banks. And they have this ultimate control over how money functions and behaves. Bitcoin changes that. Bitcoin removes the necessity for that, while still keeping everything else roughly the same. In similar ways, you can imagine, for example, education being decentralized in similar ways. You can imagine, it already is in a lot of ways with smaller towns when they go and organize their own town festivals, or in our town we're going to set these particular speed limits, or hey, we're going to get rid of speed limits in our town and let people just drive carefully. That's something which has been tried in a few towns in the Netherlands, for example. So you can have this kind of local approach towards things and let that scale out. And that's generally the way I advocate for anarchistic approaches. There are actually some examples, though, in real life of that happening at a broader scale. So in northeastern Syria, you've got an area commonly known as Rojava, the official name is something like the Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria, or something like that. And they have this libertarian socialist approach. So you've got your local tribal villages, and they get together and communicate their ideas, and then they'll send representatives to go and meet each other and discuss. The difference between that and a representative democracy is that in a representative democracy, you have representatives who make decisions on your behalf. In this kind of approach, the representatives are representing the decisions that have already been made at the local scale, and they don't get to make new decisions on their own. So I think it's a much more bottom-up approach and a much more effective approach to a free society.
Can you tell me some of those features, like the advantages of some of those features, including layer 2s as well, which is still an emerging thing in Bitcoin, and obviously the other networks are kind of way ahead in that regard. So.
Yes and no, but yep, okay. Yeah, Bitcoin itself, the reason I got interested in it is because it is this decentralized approach towards money, and what that gives you is the people actually having control over how money behaves. So people say, Bitcoin has these very set rules and you can't change them. That's not actually technically true. Bitcoin's rules can be changed by anyone who chooses to change them for themselves and for themselves only. But if I change the rules of my node, so I changed my Bitcoin rules to say there's going to be different rules on what is a valid transaction and what's not, most likely I'm just going to end up forking myself off the rest of the network. The rest of the network then ignores my node because I'm not in consensus with them. But if I got a large group of people to do it, then now we have two different kinds of Bitcoin, the one within this group of people and the one outside that group of people. If that spread out to everyone, now we've changed Bitcoin's rules for everyone. So essentially, Bitcoin is just a consensus algorithm at whatever scale you choose to have it. If it's purely personal, it's kind of useless because money isn't something you can use on your own. Money is a social thing. Money is something you use with other people. So I have to have at least somebody else who agrees with my network rules. Otherwise, I can't do anything. But the broader that is, the more useful it is. So that's how you end up with this kind of rough consensus evolving inside Bitcoin to say these are the best rules for everyone without having a central rule giver, which is essentially anarchism in practice. So that's what really excited me about Bitcoin, and I still see that happening today. We do have changes in Bitcoin. It's just very slow, and it takes this consensus approach to actually make them happen. Layer 2s are very, very similar, but you tend to have different kind of game theory applied on top of it, different trade-offs, and they're not necessarily bad. So I gave a talk a few months ago in Prague called Nothing is Trustless, and that's something I stick very much to. People in this space talk all of the time about trustless systems. I've got a system here and we don't have to trust anyone. That's actually not true. Every single system involves trust. You just have different kinds of trust assumptions and trade-offs and trust metrics that you need to take into account. So minimizing those is great, but in layer 2s, you'll have different trust assumptions than you do on layer 1. So Lightning, I think, is a wonderful layer 2 on Bitcoin. It's a lot of people talk smack about it. It's kind of the punching bag a lot of the time. Hey, Lightning doesn't scale as well as it should, or whatever. But in practice, it works, and we're using it every day. Lightning's trade-offs involve things like having to actually have your node online or have another node who you trust to be able to talk on your behalf if your node is offline, these kinds of things. But those are just different trust assumptions, and if you're willing to accept those, that's fine, same as any other system.
A running theme that I've been exploring over the last year and a half is the idea of degens. And it seems like these layer 2 projects kind of attracting degens to Bitcoin that might not otherwise have been there, and in doing so, I've heard the argument that they're clogging up the chain with a whole lot of images of just like rubbish art and what have you.
So I would generally agree with that assessment, but even though it's something I don't like, it's not something I would say I should try to stop. It's people doing what they choose to do. And the best thing that I can do is convince them that it's a bad idea, it doesn't make sense, it's essentially just gambling. I think that's a bad thing to do, but it's on them to learn that lesson. It's not on me to force them not to do so. So yeah, I think they are clogging up the chain. It does make other transactions more expensive. That is annoying. But in that way, we do have layer twos which help us avoid those kinds of things. It's very rare that I will make a Bitcoin on-chain transaction, whereas I use Lightning literally every day. I get paid in Bitcoin. I pay a lot of my expenses in Bitcoin. I've been living on Bitcoin exclusively since 2017. So I give my kids pocket money in Bitcoin, and almost all of that is over the Lightning network. So on-chain transaction cost is important because it causes problems for people being able to open new channels on Lightning or close channels that have previously been opened, but it's not affecting the individual day-to-day transactions as much.
Something that is often highlighted, as like, especially we're here in Frankfurt, as it's known, is the laundering aspect of cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin, etc. Versus how the big banks get away with it, and the penalties that they the fines that they get in repercussions to their actions, and how the authorities such as the SEC are approaching this is kind of interesting, because right now we're seeing them try to imprison code, or fine code as opposed to institutions. So how do you see that sort of relationship or dynamic between the two evolving over the next decade?
That's a $1 million question. Seeing the future. I prefer to try to avoid thinking about what centralized entities are going to do, and I would rather think about how do we make them obsolete and make them irrelevant. So, I think for a start, for example, you mentioned the word laundering. I think the entire concept of money laundering is a stupid idea, because the money laundering as a concept means there is clean money and dirty money. Money is money. It's used for transacting. The thing that you didn't want to happen, which the monetary transaction was involved in, is potentially something you don't want. For example, selling a 12-year-old girl as a slave or whatever. It's a terrible, horrible thing. And the proceeds of that money, the proceeds of the money that was transferred for that, is somehow labeled dirty money at that point because it was used for a bad deed. But I actually don't see a problem with the money. I see a problem with the deed. I would far rather we concentrate on removing those activities from society, punishing those activities, but don't punish the money. It's this meaningless, weird thing. It's almost like saying we're going to use money as a way to find who is doing bad stuff and then punish them in some way by tracking the money. But the side effects of that are worse than the problem a lot of the time, because you end up with different classes of money, which then goes back to having centralized control over money, which is how we got into this entire mess that we're in the world at the moment. The wealth divide between rich and poor is growing ever more. Essentially, society is cracking at the edges, and I think a lot of that is the way that money is handled. So, getting rid of money laundering as a concept would help, even if it is going to be problematic in a few ways for the people who do those kinds of things.
Like, how's New Zealand approaching in all of this stuff? Like, in your opinion, are they doing a good job? Are they doing better than Oz, for example?
So I haven't been back to New Zealand in a very long time, but I do try and kind of watch what's going on back home. And generally speaking, I think from a legal standpoint, New Zealand's not doing great, but I'd say it's similar to Australia. However, there are differences culturally. So New Zealand, like Australia in some ways, has some vast areas with absolutely nobody in it. Especially in the south where I grew up. I grew up in a town of like 50,000 people. The next town over is 200 kilometres away, and that's 100,000 people. You want to get to even 500,000 people, you're going 500 kilometres. So you've got this huge area where there's not a lot of people, and people are very self-governing. That's something you don't get so much here in Europe, for example, where everybody is constantly watched by everyone else, and you've constantly got massive police forces nearby and that kind of thing. So in these more remote parts of the world, you have less centralized control over how people behave. So even though from a legal standpoint, I think places like Australia and New Zealand look quite draconian actually with a lot of the laws, I think it matters less to those people because people can just kind of ignore it a lot of the time and say, yeah, whatever, it doesn't affect me, don't care. So I think there are a lot more things like peer-to-peer use of money, or alternative monies like Bitcoin, in those places than the law would allow, and they just don't care. It's not relevant to them because it's not part of their daily lives.
Thank you kindly, Ben.
Yep, absolute pleasure.